All right, good afternoon, class. I'm checking in with you a little late this afternoon, where we were talking earlier today. We were discussing various schools of this growing academic discipline, science discipline of ecology, which begins and grows throughout the 20th century, starting with the efforts of people like Ellen Swallow Richards in the development of human ecology. And then we left off today talking about the second school of ecology, and that is organismic ecology. And we specifically were talking about the contributions of Clements, Frederick Clements, who is essentially the father of this particular school of ecology. And I was directing your attention to this idea that Clements, as a core of his contribution to our understanding of ecology, created this uh, organismic ecology with a couple distinct features. The first is that he defines humans as essentially outside of the natural systems and the relationships that exist between organisms and their natural environment, which is clearly a curious approach, but nonetheless it's one that he's able to advance and do some very interesting things with. And one of the key attributes of his organismic ecology is this idea of succession. And succession just refers to the natural, and this is where we can think of a biome, which is essentially a system of vegetation found in a relatively large portion of, a region, if you will, of Earth's surface. This biome in many ways conducts itself, it's almost like it has a life of its own. It's not how we normally think of things. Much of human history we've thought of organisms as individual agents acting all on their own behalf. But what Clements ties together is the idea of a biome as a region, a vegetative system that really takes on a life of its own. And even though vegetation is a flora, there are also fauna or mammals and reptiles and things of that nature that exist within this natural biome. So he's casting his attention on a fairly large system to show that biomes, like people, essentially have a succession, much as we do. We succeed as individuals from being born. We are infants, we are then toddlers, we are then children, we are then adolescents, we are then adults, we are then middle-aged adults, seniors, so on and so forth. And each of our stages of life, of course, features distinct attributes and characteristics of our being. Well, the same is true for biomes, according to Clements and the School of Organismic Ecology. And so he puts together these ideas. So primary succession is an example where a biome is starting over essentially from ground zero. Like I said, it could be due to to volcanic activity. It could be due to a flood or a fire that dramatically transforms the landscape. But nature is resilient, nature is dynamic, and it doesn't sit still or remain still for too terribly long. And if it seems like it's sitting still for a long period of time, that's just because we evaluate things in terms of human time. But in terms of earthly time, global time, pardon me, what's 100,000, 10,000 years to a natural system that is just waiting to return to its original dimensions. So you'll see here this diagram is fairly effective. It shows, imagine a landscape that has been, maybe say, you see these rocks, let's say there was a landslide, and so a landscape has been essentially started over because rocks have just covered it, say 10 feet deep. Well, over time, wind, water, erosion, weathering, you name it, create small bits of particles of soil with minerals in it. Upon this, lichens and moss grow. When the lichens and moss die, of course, they create vegetative material. It's organic matter that can then die and form the next generation of soil. And of course, if a little bit of soil is formed, that allows for seeds to catch in it And then here we have small herbs and shrubs. The small herbs and shrubs, after several generations of death and decay, will then create what they refer to here as a heath mat. And then you see all of this is a progression. It's a succession whereby the soil and the substrate of that land is being returned to a later version of itself. We don't normally think about this, but even trees have their succession. There are a number of trees that don't do well in shade, and they tend to be pioneering trees. They grow for a little bit, and then in the shade or in the protection of these trees, later succession trees like firs, birch, spruce, they grow. And then here we have what is oftentimes referred to as a climax community. So you see over a period of decades or centuries or millennia, a succession takes place within nature that results in a changed and altered set of characteristics. We call this succession. And as you can see here, this means that nature, like human beings, in many ways responds to the changing circumstances that surround it. So Clements realizes this, or brings this theory to our attention, and you can see that through primary succession and then secondary succession, these are progressive stories whereby nature, left to its own devices, will recover and be resilient, kind of a happy ending, so to speak. Well, Clements poses this model again in 1939, and of course we know about what happens in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl and the hardship, the greatest environmental disruption and crisis of the 20th century, perhaps of one of the leading economic crises of world history. Maybe the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of a couple springs ago at least compares with it. But this was a time of tremendous hardship brought about by a disruption of natural processes. So what Clements argues in this book is that we have this natural model of succession and it works just great. If humans do not disrupt and intervene, nature has an incredible capacity to correct itself. Unfortunately, what happens, according to Clements, which explains the Dust Bowl, is that it's this human disruption. It's the using of fossil fuels and tractors to disrupt the natural topsoil of the Great Plains. It bears the soil. It opens up the Great Plains to needless exposure to wind, rain, erosion, weathering. You have it. And so he gives a pretty profound example of how the organismic school of ecology is disrupted by the human intervention and problems associated with human mismanagement and abuse of the natural systems, which, if the Great Plains had been left to their own devices, they would have fared much better. So the Great Plains Committee is actually an agency and an organization that forms out of response to this organismic model of ecology. So we see it actually having a concrete response. It gives way to a specific solution. And so one of the findings of the Great Plains Committee is that nature has a lot to teach us, and if we observe it, if we note the sort of general progression of succession, and if human land use cooperates, or I should say if human land use abides by the example that nature shows us, if we don't disrupt these natural processes of succession that are implicit to the organismic model of ecology, then we will be supporting the natural set of relationships that exist between organisms and their natural environment. However, if we do things like the farming practices prior to the Dust Bowl period of the 1930s, then we of course will be failing to respect the natural model that exists in nature. And this becomes known as the balance of nature. And hang on to that term, because as we explore Rachel Carson later on this week, we're going to notice that she makes use of this idea of balance of nature, meaning the natural tendency of nature. When left to its own devices, nature is a self-correcting set of systems. It's only when we, through our human arrogance and our excessive use of the land, that we create these imbalances. So this is all an important part of the organismic ecology school. Now finally, there's another school, pardon me, that is worth our noting. And in the mid-20th century, and we see it here kind of as early as the 1920s, but it's really the 1950s that the economic ecology school will really find its bearings. And the idea of the economic ecologists, their finding conclusions is that it's completely acceptable for humans to interact with nature, to use nature to meet the growing set of human needs, that there's nothing about this quote-unquote balance of nature that should really bind human behavior, that essentially the idea that nature has this natural tendency that we're obligated to respect is essentially a fallacy. One of the examples that folks like Henry Gleason use to sort of discredit the models of Frederick Clements and the organismic school of ecology is that, throughout world history, and even prior to world history, prehistoric civilizations, humankind has used nature and interacted with it in some fairly powerful ways. For example, some of the earliest inhabitants of the Great Plains would use fire to burn trees and open up prairie to create habitat for animals like the bison, so on and so forth. And so when the economic ecologists read books or see the formation of the Great Plains Committee in the 1930s, their response is, hey, look, the Great Plains is a region, it's a biome of the United States that really does bear a strong imprint of past human land uses. So even to call attention to a pre-Dust Bowl ideal like a golden age of the Great Plains is nonsense, because the early plains and even river bottom societies that existed in the central and western parts of the United States, what's now the United States, even those were incredibly managed and sort of aggressively utilized by the human presence. They were aggressively utilized by humans. So with that, I'm going to stop there for today, and this will give us a good base for moving on tomorrow to talking about Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold. All right.